Okay, so good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you may be. Welcome to the 6th lecture in our Decolonizing Global Health seminar series, hosted by Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service in the Science, Technology and International Affairs program, as well as the Center for Global Health Science and Security. As this seminar series is being held as part of these academic programs, we are joined today in the Zoom room by a number of Georgetown students who will be able to interact directly with the speaker at the end of the lecture during the Q&A session. But we're also joined live on YouTube by a number of members of the public. So if you would like to ask questions of the speaker, please put in your comments in the chat and we'll try to integrate those into the discussion as well. And please subscribe to the channel to keep updated on future seminars and other content, or to check out some of our past lectures in this series. So last week's lecture continued to explore the themes of representation and particularly asked what it meant to be local, particularly in the context of global health. Dr. Nambiar suggested that we should all strive for authentic engagement and seek to understand what that means as a means of acknowledging our own privileges and also recognizing other forms of knowledge and authority. While we can all seek to gain greater humility and authenticity as individuals, what does this actually mean for the mechanisms and structures that govern global health on a larger scale? Tonight, we will have the opportunity to interrogate this question a little bit more, learning how global health institutions themselves need to stop perpetuating global health inequities. And we are very lucky to have a leading thinker on these issues with us tonight. So Dr. Ngozi Erondu trained as an infectious disease epidemiologist and has also studied health system policy and global health governance. She currently runs the social enterprise public-private partnership Project Zambezi, which is a novel tech-enabled logistics approach to improve access to essential medicines throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And she also serves at the same time as an associate fellow at the Chatham House, a international affairs and strategic think tank based in London in the UK. Previously, Dr. Erondu has also been an assistant professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and also served as a senior public health advisor for Public Health England. So she provides quite a unique interdisciplinary approach across multiple sectors. And to this end, she's provided technical support on topics like strengthening institutional capacity to control infectious diseases to numerous national, regional, and international bodies, such as the Nigeria Centers for Disease Control, the US CDC, the Africa Centers for Disease Control, and the World Health Organization, to name but a few, as well as other governments around sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Before I hand over to Dr. Erondu, I do want to provide our usual reminder that we are all on a path of learning in this space. The topics that we'll be discussing are important for advancing equity and justice, but may not always be comfortable. I encourage us all to lean into that discomfort while practicing the gifts of empathy and grace, while we acknowledge that everyone may be on a different path on that point of journey, and that we're all making the most of this opportunity to learn and apply that knowledge towards changing global health for the better. And so with that, it is my pleasure to turn over to Dr. Erondu for her lecture, Beyond Tokenism: How do we stop global health institutions from perpetuating global health inequities? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stanley. Let me just show my screen one moment. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, I think you said yes. Okay. Good evening or good day to everybody. I just want to thank Dr. Stanley and Dr. Mendenhall for inviting me to give this lecture. I actually had a bit of a preface as well, but Dr. Stanley already said a lot of what I wanted to say, and I just really wanted to say that, like most of us working in global health, I exist in different realms. It crosses nationalities and countries, as well as even, different levels of privilege. And I say this because while global health has a larger issue with equity and fairness, our approach as individuals may be highly tailored to the intersections that we represent. And so please note, while there are institutional approaches that are needed to rectify some of the issues that I'm going to bring up today, at an individual level, we may need a more tailored approach for, towards our specific circumstances. And for my part, this lecture really reflects my observations and experiences, but it also is a product of a product of many others that I've spoken to, so many people's stories and experiences as well. Specifically, as I've worked in academia in the UK, and I've worked on outbreak response in the US, the UK, as well as regions in the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. So this really is coming from me, but I hope that it also kind of reflects those other voices as well. All right, so today I want to talk to you about how academic and research institutions actually create and perpetuate inequity in global health. I'm going to discuss this in three parts. I'll first talk about a familiar global health story that illustrates the consequence of inequities in global health. And then I will share personal experiences as well as wider trends of structural inequities in global health institutions. And then thirdly and finally, I will talk about different mind shifts and suggestions that we all can do to combat inequities. And I'll talk about this on an individual as well as an institutional level. So let's start by everyone just putting themselves into this image. And imagine a young doctor. He's just returned to this practically empty hospital. And he's reflecting on the villagers that he had encountered that day, as well as the previous days throughout the week. Many of these villagers were bleeding and feverish, and they all were desperate to survive. He had seen malaria, cholera, and meningitis. And now seeing them, he wondered if their condition could be some of these diseases or all of these diseases, or perhaps none of these diseases. He looks down at the dried blood in the cracks of his palm, and then he runs off to wash his hands. The young man would eventually persuade a very sick nun to leave the mission hospital and go with him to the capital city of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is Kinshasa, where he would be able to take a blood sample. Her blood samples would ultimately produce the first isolated Ebola virus, which was analyzed and characterized by scientists in Belgium as well as in the US. And now let's go to the part of the story that we all know. So a couple of months ago, I Googled this, who discovered Ebola, and Professor Peter Piot's name came up. So most of the people who know about the story of Ebola discovery, especially people that are not on this call right now, they believe that the story starts here with Professor Piot, who was a young scientist that was part of the Belgium team to transport and analyze these samples. And they don't know that it really begins with this young man, who I spoke of at the beginning of the story. This is Dr. Jean-Jacques Moyembe. And Dr. Moyembe, as he's called, he bravely assessed, treated, and looked after the first known cases of Ebola. He didn't have any gloves. He didn't have any protective clothing. And Dr. Moyembe and the original clinical team in Kinshasa are just as important to the story of Ebola discovery as Professor Peter Piot and the Centers for Disease Control, as well as the Institution of Tropical Medicine in Belgium. So my question to you is, who decides who appears and disappears in the story of scientific achievement and discovery? And how resonant is this type of story right now, when the world has entered into our world of science and epidemiology and public health, a world where the average person understands a bit about transmission and relative risk, a world where we applaud our health workers because they are quite literally putting their lives on the line for us. Well, in 1976, and for decades to follow, there was no applause for Dr. Moyembe. I think that few people know that most global health stories are as complementary as this story about Ebola discovery, yet we often only hear one side. And we hear this one side very early in our public health careers, usually at the stage where most of the students that are watching this, at the stage where you are now. Few institutions understand that ensuring equity and representation in global health is not about revisionist history or minimizing the accomplishments of Europeans or white majority institutions. It is simply about inclusion and fairness. And fairness is what I had in mind when I wrote this article for Stat News in 2019 in February. I had recently stopped working at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. After 8 years there, I did 4 years as a PhD student and then 4 years as an assistant professor. And as a student, I witnessed several of my classmates from low and middle income countries, or just from non-UK countries, struggle with their usually white doctoral supervisors or other staff members. For example, I know 3 students, one East Asian, one African, and one Caribbean, who did not finish their PhDs. And I think in the US, it's a big deal not to finish your PhD, but in the UK, it's a very rare occurrence, and it's a big deal. All of them had issues communicating with their supervisors, and there is often a stronger hierarchical culture in their countries, so voicing this discontent to authorities is really challenging. But it was also sad that their supervisors did not try to overcome these barriers. And in these cases, the result was that the students were left to fail. And when I became a professor, I had my own uncomfortable experiences. Initially, I was surprised at how dismissive some of my students were of me. I was sure that it was me, that I had imposter syndrome or something. And so I would prepare for days, sometimes weeks for a single class. But I saw very little change in regards to the respect from specifically my European students. Also, I felt that some of my colleagues overly questioned my contribution or minimized it. Now, you may be thinking that, 3 fellow students and my experience is a really small sample size. Well, in January 2019, a study was published in The Lancet, which helped me to realize that I wasn't just imagining these things. This study, which was led by researchers at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the National University of Singapore, sought to understand if the top public health universities were safeguarding fairness and inclusion or simply just talking about it. They did this by analyzing 15 top US, UK, and Canadian universities, public health universities. They found similar statistics that you may have seen before. I know if you've read anything from Professor Pai, he talks about this a lot. But overall, they found that there were still wide gaps in gender and ethnic representation in senior positions at these public health universities. Across all universities, women were concentrated at junior positions and men at senior positions. And representation of women declined between middle and senior academic levels, despite women outnumbering men at the junior level. And this effect was magnified for ethnic minority women, who made up 19% of junior staff and only 9%, and then they were only 9% represented at the senior level. In contrast, white men, they represented 25% of junior staff, but rose to 46% at the senior level. You can see how the trajectories of the purple line, which are the white men, and the blue line, which are the ethnic women, how they diverge in this graph on the right. So this study emboldened me to add my personal experience to these numbers. When I first wrote that stat piece that I showed earlier, I didn't expect it to become part of the decolonized global health discussion, but of course it is, and it was. Because my experience, the findings from this Lancet study, and all the personal stories that I have heard since are speaking about the same issue, which is persistent institutionalized discrimination. Sorry. So now we're all good people on this call, and I find that most of my colleagues across the various institutions that I've worked at, they're all good people. And what do good people try to do? They try, when they hear things that make them uncomfortable or they hear things that are wrong, they try to fix it. But sometimes fixing something too quickly can be harmful as well. Actually, before I go, I'm going to talk about tokenism. Before I go into that, I just want to put the definition of institutional discrimination on here just to make sure that we're all on the same page. All right, so what I am describing now is tokenism. So during this talk, I want us to remember that the solution to institutional discrimination is not just adding a Malaysian to one panel and a woman to a specific commission. It's not about sprinkling diversity everywhere. That's not okay. Tokenism is the practice of making only a perfunctory or symbolic effort to do a particular thing, especially by recruiting a small number of people from underrepresented groups in order to give the appearance of sexual or racial equality within a workforce. Okay, so now I want to talk about specific issues to inclusion. And it seems like you may have gone through some of these in previous lectures, but I think it's okay if we refresh it a little bit. So one big challenge to inclusion and local ownership in science is publication bias and a lack of Southern scientists being represented in our literature. So it's well documented that there is a bias in scientific publications. This bias is towards men, towards English-speaking authors, and authors from certain institutions. The current publishing model is frankly just full of unconscious bias. One study found that manuscripts from high-income countries had 6 times greater odds of being accepted for publication than an article from a low and middle-income country. And this hurts those overlooked authors, but it also limits scientific progress. The same study showed that even with the minimal low and middle income country publications that were accepted by the journals, those that were accepted, they greatly increased the topic diversity in these journals. And I think that's really important because in a globalized world, the importance of understanding diseases that may show up in the global south, it's really sad if we're actually not documenting this and we're not seeing it through this local lens, and because we're not understanding the epidemiology, the behavioral response for the population, and we are missing the pathology of emerging and re-emerging diseases as well. And I hope in today's environment that this is something that we all can agree on, that it's not okay if we miss out on this. And beyond this, I think that the reason that we still do not see specifically many African scientists publishing is because we do science with different motivations. So one of my colleagues said the following to me. She said that many of my white colleagues do science to build their career through publications. They are on an intellectual exploration. But for me, it's a need to solve a crucial problem that may be hurting or killing my people. So these different motivations, they affect our output. And another point is who has time to publish? Now, this is not applicable to every Northern or every Southern scientific situation. When I say Northern and Southern, I mean the global North and the global South, as we refer to kind of higher income countries and lower income countries. So it's not the situation for every single institution, but I do think it highlights something very important. To contribute to academic literature, you need to have time to think and to write. Now, there is a risk to apply a tokenistic solution here. So during the Ebola outbreak, many of my African counterparts who were really brilliant in their fieldwork and had great ideas for publication, they didn't often have time to publish. They were in the field, they were working. Yet, at the end of this is the West African Ebola outbreak. At the end of that outbreak, I saw many of their names on different publications, which was interesting to me because I knew that, I didn't have time to write during that outbreak either. So one particularly bright colleague, he came to London School to do his MSc, and I had the honor of being his supervisor. I quickly realized that there was no way that he could have written or co-authored. And in some cases, he was even like second author. But I realized that there was no way that he could have written these papers. He was also, his primary language was not English. And even though he could communicate very, very well, we all know that you have to be trained in scientific writing. I mean, I have to be trained all of us have to be trained in scientific writing. It's not something that just comes very easily. So I'm glad that he did learn to write scientifically during his year at London School. because now that he can actually shape the science and the policy recommendations that will come out of this research, and it will, help to inform future papers. But I guess what I'm bringing this up because it's not okay to just stick people's names on publications so that it can seem fair, it can seem inclusive. That doesn't help science, and it doesn't help the scientist. So many of you have probably read this article or seen it, how not to write about global health. And it's satirical, yet the sharpness of its truth really cuts many of us in global health. There's so many points throughout that article that I was like, oh my gosh, like I've done this or I've seen this, and this really needs to change. So I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the quotes that Mr. Desmond Jumboom that he had throughout this article as kind of a cautionary tale for us. One quote is, in order to ensure that your project has the buy-in of the community, set up a 1 to 2 day workshop with community members to get their input on the project, for which you already have found funding and a protocol. Another quote is, if you have already advanced far along on a manuscript and realize that you have none or too few local authors on your paper and are likely to be tarred and feathered on Twitter for the lack of author diversity, you can always reach out to the acquaintance that you met once on your 1 week trip. So the truth in this type of behavior is so common that it can be imperceptible. I am currently writing an Africa-related COVID-19 paper, and I refuse to include articles, I refuse to reference articles where there are no African authors. And I keep thinking, as I'm looking for different papers to cite, how would Americans react if there were 20 authors from, let's say, Chad and Uganda, and they were talking about how the lack of leadership in the US led to a failed response of COVID-19, and that was published in the New England Medical Journal. I mean, we all know that wouldn't happen, yet it happens over and over and over again when Global North authors talk about Global South realities. I'm sorry, if you can give me one moment, I just have to put this on pause. Sorry about that. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So next, I just wanted to talk about it matters where knowledge is actually generated. So I'm sure that we can all recognize that these logos and the powerhouses that they represent in terms of power and influence in global health. I know we can recognize most of these are kind of institutions that I've been associated with or I've spoken to recently. Many of these are actual colonial institutions that were put in place after World War I, and they drive what we consider right when we're talking about global health. I've also found myself being quick to criticize the public health measures to contain, let's say, COVID-19 in countries like India or Rwanda. And I often have to remind myself that they have their own cultures and context and customs that they are using alongside science, just like we all are doing in our countries. And we clearly don't have all the answers in our own Western countries. So why are Northern institutions the most influential within the global health world? I wanted to highlight this recent Nature article that I wrote with my colleagues, Dr. Dorothy Pepra and Dr. Michelle Khan, because some of these issues that I'm bringing up, people within the schools, us who have our stakeholders within these institutions, so students, alumni, professors, etc., we have the power to be the change that we want to see. In this correspondence, it was published in Nature Medicine. We write about colonial legacies of schools and how they need to be dismantled, and how things that have happened in the past actually really affect the way we curate and deliver public health now. And we highlight London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine because that's where I'm an alumni of, as well as that's where I taught. Dr. Michelle Khan is a current associate professor there, and Dr. Dorothy Pepper is also, she also attended London School for her PhD as well. And so we have, you know, we've invested in this university and we want it to be better. And so one reason why we wrote this article is to hold London School's feet to the fire and ensure that they're being accountable. You know, there's a letter that's gone around the school that has really highlighted some of the unfortunate instances that have happened with, you know, students feeling that, you know, the delivery of lectures were insensitive or not inclusive, and, you know, writing in nature medicine or doing other activities can really help us to hold our institution accountable. So I just wanted to show that we all, you know, can make our institutions accountable. All right, so another shortcoming in academia is the lack of staff diversity. So barriers resulting from institution level practices and norms can stifle career success among underrepresented groups. It's documented that affinity bias, which means promoting people that look like you or have a similar background, affinity bias systematically affects minorities throughout their careers. The lack of role models that are female or people of color have a devastating impact on students as well. As a professor, I could see that this desire for a shared experience is really magnified when working with students from foreign countries, especially students from low and middle income countries. Because of my background and my age, many African students especially felt comfortable to confide in me or ask questions that they may have been too shy to ask my white counterparts. And it's hard to overstate how important it is to ensure that we have qualified people of color around the table, especially when we have a diverse student body. So one of the loudest statements that an institution can make is its silence on representation, especially its silence on representation among the staff. So I've spent quite a lot of time articulating the issues of lack of inclusion and fairness in global health institutions. And instead of prescribing solutions to each issue, I will instead suggest mind shifts that institutions and individuals can use to self-correct. So first is that we need to be part of a new model of dignified international partnerships. And that really has to do with starting from the start, about being honest about why we want to collaborate with a Southern institution, especially if, you know, Georgetown being a Northern institution. Begin with the intellectual journey of research with your partners. So like in those examples that I gave earlier and from Mr. Desmond's article, it's not including the local collaborating center or the community should not be an afterthought. They should be part of the entire intellectual journey. Yeah, you do not have to, oh, sorry, I'll do the next one, which is we need to deconstruct structural prejudice and colonial tendencies by making room for different perspectives. We all need training on inclusion and diversity. Every academic that interacts with students and colleagues from different cultures, so all academics, should have a professional development requirement to have such trainings. We also need to think of different forums to hear voices that may not be as comfortable speaking up in department meetings, for example. Finally, we need data. We should all be asking for data on gender and ethnicity representation in our institutions so that we can interrogate any disparities that we find. And finally, mentorship matters. So you do not have to run a research project to make a difference. Everyone attending this call can be a peer mentor and an advocate. Within our universities, but also in the field, the places that you will eventually go, the places that, you know, all these students will eventually go, these are the places where we can make a difference. And I've seen entire organizations change when people who are trained at places like Georgetown go back and change the environment of their workplaces. We need to think about how we can support each other and lean in when necessary and lean out when necessary as well. So Professor Madupai talks about leaning out a lot. So, you know, people from Northern institutions, men, there's so many opportunities that we can give other people the stage. And I think that's something that we all need to reflect on individually. And finally, I just wanted to add about decolonizing ourselves. You know, we are all the products of our environment. Um, I'm sure you've heard like the fish in water analogy, and you know, all these prejudices and the things that our culture really that we imbibe from our culture, like that's part of us. And so we really need to have self-awareness. I wanted to highlight these two articles, and Dr. Stanley brought this up in Twitter. Are we really interested in decolonizing global health? This is from Laura Makumba, who is part of the Duke Decolonizing group. And I thought it was a great article, because it's really questioning, you know, if you look at where all these decolonizing global health, where these conferences are happening, where these talks are happening, is mostly in the Northern institutions. And she really was warning that, you know, decolonized global health doesn't become a colonial practice in itself. And a few months ago, myself, Dr. Pai, and another colleague named Dr. Khatri, we wrote an article about silenced voices in global health. And what we were really doing was thinking about whose voices are we not hearing? Even, you know, me, I'm Nigerian, I'm American. I went to school in the global North. I have family in Nigeria. I work in Nigeria. I work throughout the global South. But I have access to people in places that someone growing up in a rural area in Nigeria does not have access to. And so can I really say that I can represent, you know, communities that are in rural areas in Nigeria? Am I the best person to talk about, you know, community-based movements? You know, it's arguable. It's in many ways I'm not the best person, but in other ways I may be the only person, just because of, you know, the privilege and the platform that I have. So being self-aware and understanding the limitations of your voice is very important. It's clear that a person can belong to an underrepresented population but still be highly privileged. And so we really need to be okay with being uncomfortable and being transparent and being reflective about who we actually are. So if you leave with anything today, remember that decolonizing global health and ending institutional discrimination, it starts with the individual, but it ends with the institution. Institutional norms are upkept and perpetuated when enough of us acquiesce to the status quo. No matter, and we usually acquiesce to the status quo no matter how harmful the consequences could be. So, you know, a talk like this and the series that you all are doing, it's a phenomenal way for us to really to change our mindset when it comes to what global health really should be and what it looks like. But it's also a way to equip ourselves as individuals, because individual actions do matter. So I just want to end where I started, which is with Dr. Moyembe. So Dr. Moyembe has dedicated the last 4 decades to public health in DRC, fighting Ebola. And in fact, he has taken part in every Ebola outbreak and is leading the current response to Ebola and COVID-19 today in Congo. And he heads the DRC's National Institute for Biomedical Research in Kinshasa. He was also the 2019 recipient of the Noguchi Africa Prize. And on 22nd September of this year, he was listed as one of Time Magazine's top 100 people of 2020. So Dr. Moyembe is a public health hero that very few people in public health actually know about. And I'm certain that there are hundreds of Dr. Moyembes, as well as Professor Piot's, that have come and will come through the doors of Georgetown University and other public health universities around the world. And our institutions must make sure that all of them have a fair foundation to be as great as they can be. Okay, so I am done. Thank you.
so much for that. So I think what we'll do is turn it over to the students first for questions and see if they have any thoughts, and just do sort of about 15-20 minutes discussion, if that's okay. So yes, over to you, students. Any preliminary thoughts or questions?
I've got one, if that's okay. First, thank you very much for that lecture. It was incredibly interesting, and I think you raised some fantastic points, and definitely convicting, being at a place like Georgetown. But so you also mentioned your recent Nature Medicine piece, which I think most, if not all of us, probably gave a read before you presented. And towards the end, you and your co-authors mentioned King's College London is a particularly good model. I think because you had cited they'd been working a long time to embed equality, diversity, and inclusion to their infrastructure, which all sounds great, but obviously doing that at a big, large institution can prove challenging sometimes. So I was wondering if you had any more details about what specifically they did, or how they did it, and if it could serve as a model for other institutions like King's College London.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually know the professor there who is kind of spearheading a lot of the work on diversity and inclusion in at King's College. I think one of the first places that they started was collecting data. And a lot of schools, like I remember I've been doing this presentation for a while, and it's very difficult to get, data on inclusion and diversity. Even that Lancet article that I cited, what the authors did was they looked for like non-Anglo names, like it's so when I say there's 9% of minority women in senior positions, that includes Eastern Europeans, that includes anybody that didn't have an Anglo-Saxon name, like it includes a lot of people, because it's so hard to get actual information on this. So I think where they started was just documenting, just understanding who was there, and looking at their staff, but also looking at their student body. A lot of people actually do collect data on students, but they don't do it so much on staff. So the way to start is that way. King's also has, for everybody in their community, because I tried to access this, but I couldn't, they make that data transparent. They also have indicators of for diversity and inclusion that they also make transparent. Like you can actually go online if you're part of like the King's College community and, really keep track of these indicators. You can, use them to talk to senior staff if you have questions about you can actually engage with this and have a starting point and a goal. Without data, there's nothing to talk about really. So I think a first start is just collecting data on who's where and where what do they represent, and not just with ethnicity. I mean, I think ethnicity is really important. That's what we're talking about today, but also where have they worked? Where have they, what is their background? What is their kind of intellectual diversity? I think there are different ways that we can represent the students that we are supposed to be nurturing, so that should be collected as well.
Thank you.
Can I ask a piggyback on that? Because I'd really love to know your take on also how soft and hard money institutions affect diversity and inclusion and promotion. Just wondering on your perspective.
Do you mean specifically like how they're funded? Like, can you?
Like King's would be, so LSHEM is soft money, right? So most people, if you want any security, you have to have a Wellcome Trust fellowship. But King's would most likely pay your salary. You wouldn't have to pay your salary from grants.
Well, I know that I don't know if I can answer this as well as you may want me to, but I know that one thing that we are trying to, when I say we, there's a lot of global health leaders right now in this space trying to understand how we can do more than write articles. And one thing that we're focusing on are the funders. So we're focusing on Wellcome Trust, and we're focusing on Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and all these funders that give money to people. And we're focusing on them in their own institutions. Like the Wellcome Trust it doesn't make any sense that they basically provide, I think they're the second, the second largest funder in the UK, could be in the world, but I'm sure in the UK. And on their board, there's not one person of color. I mean, it makes no sense because a lot of the money is going to Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. And, I have a friend who just started working at the Wellcome Trust. So she's not on the board or anything, but she's one of the only people of color in a senior position there. And there are people that are making really impactful decisions when they have no idea, like, what is the reality on the ground, and that's really scary. So we're trying to hold them accountable within their own institutions. We haven't yet tackled, like how they actually give money, but I guess I do have one example. So during COVID-19, I had heard of several Wellcome senior researchers that were not, so they were staying home and they were quarantining, but they were making their field staff stay out. And, what I love about Jeremy Farrar, the director of Wellcome Trust, is that he's so active on Twitter, and it's actually him on Twitter. And you can actually just tweet him and say, like, this is crazy, what's happening? And he will respond in less than 24 hours. That I didn't even mention names, but the person had pulled their field staff back. And this was at the beginning of COVID. So there was no PPE. There was no like plan in place to actually protect these people. And so, yeah, I do think we need to focus on the funders. Dr. Mendenhall, I don't think I answered you specifically, but I think that's the way that we start.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually have a piggyback also onto that similar question. So related to holding institutions accountable, and I thought that was a really powerful point, especially as you talked about going beyond writing articles and what does this really mean for those of us who would love to sustain this kind of momentum going forward. So do you have a couple of pieces of advice of what we can do? I'm involved in some of the DEI efforts at Georgetown, which are very focused on racial injustice, importantly so, but don't think as much about the global issues per se. Are there ways that we can align those efforts, you think? Do you have any advice as to how we might move that forward?
Yeah, I can tell you about some of the things that is happening at London School. So institutionalizing these efforts is really important, not just, this, I'm assuming that the DEI efforts that you're doing at Georgetown, it's like part of, it's not just kind of like a commission, but it's like actually part of the school. Okay, yeah, that's great. So one thing that's happening in London School is that they have a postdoc who is actually, I mean, it's a little bit different, this is kind of my first talk to Americans. I've been mostly doing this with European institutions where colonialism is more resonant, like, of course you're focused on racial injustice, that makes sense, it's different. But this postdoc is specifically there to kind of unearth the colonial history of London School and to dig deeper and to understand, how this legacy is being perpetuated today and how it's affecting students and staff. I think that, Georgetown's old enough that you can do that too. You know what I mean? Just have people in place that actually sit and research and understand how the foundations, whether it's, slaves built this or a slave owner did this. I think that, I know cancel culture is a really sensitive word and I don't even know what it means anymore, but I think that that kind of knee-jerk reaction to just cancel everything, it really robs us of kind of understanding what happened so that it doesn't happen again. Like, we need to research and dig deeper and understand why this institution or this center may be named after so and so. And we need to actually put together, I think we need to be putting together frameworks and approaches to how we name things, how we work together with global partners. So I think that's something that needs to happen. Also, I think we need to define terms. I mean, global health is even a weird term, you know what I mean? And talking about the global north and the global south, I actually hate saying that, but I don't know what else to say. Like, what else do you describe people? And so, but I work a lot in the global south. And when I'm there, we always joke about how silly it is to say global south and global north. So obviously no one's satisfied with these concepts and terms. And I would love to see more students taking this up, like as really, you know, an intellectual um, journey and mission to kind of put together a lexicon that is palatable, that makes sense, that helps us to understand these dynamics better. But it also doesn't have to be super academic. I know I'm kind of veering into academia too much. On a practical level, I think it's just talking to our global health partners and working out systems that are dignified. So I spoke at the at ITM in Belgium, and what they do, for example, is that they do not have they do not have any administrative functions in Belgium for different projects. So like if they're having a project in Senegal, the money to hire people, like in administrative functions, the grant funding, all that stuff, it happens in Senegal. And then they partner. Now, this is after years of setting up this system. I mean, you know, it's not easy to do this overnight, but I think that we all need to be working towards that. We need to be working towards dignified partnerships. Like, why should I always wondered when I ran a study, 14 countries, a malaria study with 14 countries, and we were responsible for everything, hiring the consultants that would be on the ground, you know, managing the larger funding. But it's just this imbalance of power. Like, we held all the power, and that's not a partnership. That's not a true collaboration. So I think that really reflecting on the processes and in collaboration with our global south or our partners, full stop, is what needs to happen. And then they need to be rewritten in a fair way.
Am I allowed to ask another question?
Yeah, sure.
This is just so fantastic, and I'm just learning a lot from you. Things we've thought about, but you're really kind of pulling threads together. And I was wondering, what are your kind of ideas about also rethinking the global health consultancy system, which is so problematic? And it's, related to the things you talked about earlier, funding and the structure of the whole program. But I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it is problematic. I think what's problematic is there's no end date, and we saw this with Haiti. Like, you can have development agencies and institutions in a country for 50 years, and it's still the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Why? Like, I think aid, I always think of, like, if I fell down and someone aided me to stand up, they wouldn't keep holding me until I'm like 100 years old. They would let me go eventually. And I think that there's challenges on both sides. Like, I think if the whole global health consultancy apparatus just stopped tomorrow, I think that it would be devastating. I don't think that that's the best way to go. But there does need to be an exit strategy, and there usually isn't. And I think that's the problem. Some agencies have changed that a little bit, like DFID. They have this kind of like graduation system where they work with countries to graduate DFID funding, or to greatly reduce DFID funding as they go forward with strengthening different capacities. Also, I'm sure Gavi does that as well. But there's two sides, right? Like, the countries also have to be ready to go as well. And I think that's quite problematic, specifically working in Africa. Sometimes, like, for example, with childhood immunizations, a lot of countries are just like, oh, well, then the partners will do this. You know what I mean? They don't even see it as a government responsibility. And so it's not just, the Western institutions or the global North, it's also these other institutions as well. And I was having a talk with a friend, because she was saying, like, can you really decolonize global health if government and institutions kind of are resting on their laurels, or they're using it as an escape to, be corrupt or whatever? And I was saying, it's so paternalistic to not allow someone to fail. Like, if a country's going to fail, because you pull out eventually, then it has to fail. I mean, the US has failed, the UK has failed, every country in the West and the global North has had an opportunity to fail. But, and I'm not saying that the global, the countries in the global South, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, I'm not saying failure like they can't succeed. I'm just saying that if the fear is, if we leave eventually one day that they will fail, and that's why we can never leave, then it's just a cycle of it's a cycle of I think stagnation. It's a cycle of, like, there's nothing that's going to change. There has to be a point where we just kind of release and allow them to lead. And there are some countries that are leading, like Rwanda, for example. I don't think Rwanda is perfect in everything, but you can't just go to Rwanda and start your own project, and say, I'm going to work in malaria here and I'm going to do it. No, you can't do that. They have, a centralized system. You have to put all the money into their basically their Ministry of Public, or the Ministry of Health, and they will tell you what you can and cannot do. And again, I'm not saying they're perfect, but at least they're doing, at least they're leading. And it's funny when countries start to lead, Western and global South, global North countries, they get really annoyed, like, oh, Rwanda is really difficult to deal with. It's like, because you're not leading, because they're taking control of their own country. They say that a lot about Ethiopia as well. So yeah, I think that we need to institute exit strategies. We need to have these gradual processes of changing who's in the driver's seat, basically.
And I think we have Jessica. Did you want to ask one final question before we wrap up?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. This lecture was so informative. So a lot of my professors in the global health department emphasize the importance of spending time in low and middle income countries where the issues we are working on are concentrated in. And they suggest engaging in programs like Global Health Corps or like Peace Corps or Princeton Asia, things like that. But I know all these programs also have pretty problematic issues in terms of not necessarily engaging in a decolonizing mindset. Do you have any thoughts on this and like suggestions for next steps for global health students who are interested in the work of decolonizing but don't really know where to start?
That is a really good question, Jessica. Yeah, like first, those programs like Peace Corps and Global Health Corps, I think that they should have lectures like this. I think that there needs to be a different mindset for how people engage with local communities, and there needs to be humility, which I don't often see from some of the younger people that are in these type of programs. I also think that there needs to be, that's why, in my lecture, I was really trying to emphasize that as individuals, we have more power than we think, It's not about, I'm just going to use a term that we all should know, like the white savior mentality. It's about learning from each other. It's so interesting that with COVID-19, you're seeing that African countries who deal with outbreaks all the time could teach us so much. Yet, countries like the US and the UK refuse to learn from them. If I was the president of the US, I would be like actually flying people from Africa over to the US to help with the response. But we're not doing that because of whatever reason, because of our arrogance or whatever. And I think that students going into the global health program going into global health need to realize that we learn from each other. It's never been one directional, ever. We're talking about it now, but it's like I said about Professor Piat and Dr. Moyembe, that was in the 70s, and like this has been researched and talked about for decades. So yeah, I think there needs to be a different approach about how we prepare people to go into these places. And then also, if you're going into like a low and middle income country for, let's say, a master's dissertation or like a summer program or something like that, I think it's really important for the universities to speak to the host institution and make sure that they're doing something that they need You know, not just you have a research project idea and you're going to go to Tanzania and do it. No, what does the Tanzanian government need? What does the HIV program in Tanzania need? Because yes, they do really need resources. They need people that can help them with data analysis. They need people that can help them with some community mobilization and things like that. But I think a lot of times we just see people doing these kind of like pop-up projects that are not really helpful. The only thing it's helpful for is publishing. So yeah, I think we need to stop that.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. This has been hugely informative. I think it's really deepened a lot of our understanding on some of the themes that we've started picking at over the last few weeks, but haven't had this much depth on. And you know, I think some of these phrases will really stick with us, like the sprinkling of diversity. That was a really powerful image that I'm certainly going to keep in my mind as something to avoid as we move forward with these kinds of conversations, particularly at the institutional level, but of course within ourselves as well. So once again, I just want to thank you so much for your time and your expertise. We've really enjoyed learning from you today, and I hope we can keep these conversations going in the future. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. It's nice to meet everybody.
Thank you.